A Kitsune Remnant by Red Devil 360, Chapter 14, and then there was one. Naruto was glad for the QB at this time. His demonic chakra running through his body served as a good source of heat in the cold heights of Lighting Country. Although he didn't doubt the mountains could be cool enough in the summer, the fact that it was midwinter in the elemental nations didn't help him. He looked at his left slightly as he felt the branch he was perched on flexed more under another body's weight. Namakemono, he greeted the other Ambu member, Taicho Kitsune. The sloth-masked Ambu nodded at him. Naruto nodded as well and turned back to watch the village in the distance. Scouting party's back? Hi, nothing good. Naruto sighed. Wouldn't have expected anything else. He shrugged. Go on then, what are we looking at? He nodded at the village. At least a whole division of Atlesian's regulars and a battalion of each Velmian and Mysterlians for support. A latest count put hunter teams at 20, mostly centered on the village's plaza and a few native auxiliary companies. Namekono listed off. Naruto frowned. There had always been people who resented the elemental nations, but there were some who went as far as to betray them and join the invaders. With people who knew the lay of the land on their side, remnant forces were able to navigate the elemental nations easier than they would have otherwise. Probably how they were able to find and take the village before them. And that's nearly 18,000 soldiers. Not surprisingly, considering the tactical position of the village, he murmured, heedless of the thoughts circling in his head. Heavy weapons, gun emplacements, mortars and artillery cannons, machine guns emplacements at the major interceptions and atop the tallest roofs. Intel was right about this. They're holding hostages in the center. Seems little half of the town's populations. Naruto grunted in frustration. If they were holding hostages, it meant they couldn't just wipe the village off the map and be done with it. They had to assault it covertly, and with 18,000 men on the defensive, surrounded by mountains as well, attacking head-on would be costly and ultimately futile. Come, he murmured to his companion and dropped from the branch to the snowy floor, both completely silent, though Naruto knew his friend followed. Both walked the short distance to their camp in silence, and they soon reached the camp guards, who nodded at them as they let them pass without issue. Ambu masks were an ID on their own. As they walked through the beige-colored tents, passing many shinobi and kunoichi, as his forces comprised of solely ninja now, they soon reached the tent in the center. It was plain and camouflaged well with the others around it to be sure that if there was ever a breach, enemy forces would never be able to tell the tents from the others around it. They entered, and it was maybe abundantly clear that it was indeed the command tent. Seals weaved into the fabric of the tent allowed the inside of the dough to be double the size that the outside was, and it was also used as maps that lined the walls. Top tables with documents were pressed into each available space, and a single bed sat in the far corner. He took off his mask and chucked it onto his bed as he walked to the center table. Ideas? He asked, brushing his hair out his eyes slightly. The sloth Ambu removed his mask to reveal Shikamaru behind it. I would say a frontal assault is not an option, but you already knew that. Naruto scoffed. We have 7,000 here, shinobi here, not even half of their numbers, and we'll be attacking the high ground into the mountains, and they'll be on the defensive. We'll be slaughtered. Shikamaru folded his arms. Mountains are to be expected, so we can't do a sneak attack. Night? Naruto shook his head. A night attack might work initially, but all it takes will be one mistake and the whole town will descend on our heads. Shikamaru walked to the table and leaned over the map. Our options are limited then. Naruto bent over the map of the village the lightning daimyo had given them. How many Ambu teams do we have? Shikamaru's nose twitched. 27 if I recall. 108 Ambu members, Naruto added. could work. What? Naruto reached over to a box and grabbed 3 pieces. The first group, he glanced a piece of deer on the map, will attack from the northeast here. They'll have the most men with 4,000, as they will likely take the most casualties. I want you to lead them. Shika nodded. A second group with the remaining men will attack from the southeast after the fighting has begun. If the time is right, the remnant forces might overcompensate and send more men than they need, relieving you of some pressure. They'll have to make it seem believable, so I'll have Boruda lead them. He placed a hawk on the map, and the Ambu. He placed the final piece on the map to the west. A fox. I will lead our Ambu behind them and rescue the hostages from under their noses. When we've finished, I'll send a signal, and you'll pull the men back, and we'll shell the village into oblivion. Naruto finished with a determined nod. The Nara nodded too. A double feint. It could work. There'll be casualties, he reminded. Naruto sighed deeply, and his shoulders sagged slightly. There are always casualties in war. It's what we do with their sacrifices that it what makes it count, he muttered. Shikamaru nodded sadly. Both teenagers hardened by the fires of war. I'll relay your orders. So he replaced his mask and made for the tent flap. Shikamaru, Naruto stopped him. Remember, be conservative. You don't have to win, only distract them. Shikamaru nodded again, this time adding a fist just above his solar plexus, where shinobi believes the source of their chakra sat. Hi, Shikakan. He bowed swiftly and left. Naruto snorted and turned back to the map, looking at the fox piece. Commander, look at how far he's come. I don't suppose I can ask you to surrender, Naruto asked hopefully as he retrieved his ninja toe. There was a deep chuckle from the entrance. Not a chance. Naruto huffed and ran his thumb along the cloth hilt for a beat. Worth a shot, he murmured. On a dime he dug and span in place with his sword extended. Takojin's own blade, apparently a double-sided Nagitana, flew over his head and grazed the wall now behind him. Naruto's own blade struck true on Taijin's own broad chest, shattering on contact. The surprise at his blades being utterly countered by Taijin's iron skin meant he didn't catch the knee until it impacted his chest, throwing him against the wall. He recovered quickly, jumping up and pushing himself off the wall in a flip of acrobatics. He slapped Takojin's shoulders on the way down and jumped back further as the small tag he placed on him detonated. A small explosion, of course, to avoid collapsing the building around them, but no less effective at taking out the standard human. But Takojin was anything but standard. Naruto landed in a crouch and watched the smoke for any activity. Did he win? He heard someone ask above him. No, that was too easy, Aspen quietly replied. And he was right. The smoke cleared, and Takejin stood unperturbed of the fact that he was just in the center of an explosion. If anything, he looked amused. Naruto eyed him worriedly. He stood easily 7 feet and was built of rock-hard muscle. Compared to his own athlete's frame, he looked completely outclassed in a straight fight, which was right on a technicality, but who said it would be a straight fight? Naruto was fast, the second to the fourth Raikage in sheer speed. Jutsu or no, if Takojin couldn't hit him, he couldn't win, but of course he had to hold back, which dials up the difficulty. Not to mention he tired and already been in a fight. It might only take a few hits to knock him down and out. As an added bonus, his jutsu tended to be wide-scaled and rather destructive, something he also couldn't use while in the presence of the students, lest he hurt or even kills them. He would even hazard a guess at that being Taijin's plan all along, and now with his ninjato shattered, his options were limited perhaps. Naruto huffed at the situation and looked at the remains of his trusty sword. I liked that sword. Saw me through the war. He threw it unceremoniously to the side. Takojin shrugged. Sorry, not sorry. He twirled his naginata and buried the one of the blades into the ground. Prepare yourself, boy. The time for talk is over. In the single step, Takejun blurred in front of him with his naginata already in motion to cleave through Naruto's chest, or would have if it wasn't for the fact that Naruto struck turned into smoke upon contact. The man in question appeared from behind mid-jump. He span in the air and jarred his leg with the lightning hitting Taijin around the head, sent him across the room but into the opposing wall in a single motion. Takojin came charging out the smoke, this time anger clearly beginning to get a hold of his action, knowing the tactic before wouldn't work again, drew two kunai and dove to the side, putting his knives into a cross guard to deflect the strong swipe. He rose and engaged Takejin at close range, making sure that his opponent couldn't get the full tactical advantage of his lower reach. It didn't seem to matter though. His kunai were unable to effectively channel chakra, and they certainly weren't strong enough to cut on their own. So for a few minutes the two shinobi were locked in combat. Takejin, with his superior defense against Naruto's speed and ability, nothing but blurs of steel and sparks to the outside world. But it couldn't last forever. Naruto misjudged an attack and didn't move far enough out of the way of the blade, and Takejin as Nagitana sliced the neat line across Naruto's abdomen and side. The pain stalled Naruto enough that on the next strike, Takejin disarmed him and grabbed the teen around the throat, hoisting him off his feet. Kitsune! Someone yelled desperately above him. Naruto choked on his own breath as his toes tried in vain to even skim the floor, and his hands barely kept him from being completely cut off from air. Hey, guess what? He choked out. Takejin squeezed tighter. What? He growled, Nagitana poised to skewer the blonde. Naruto grinned underneath his mask despite the situation. Did you know that the human body is made of 60% water? Takujin's brow furrowed in confusion, and his staff lowered lightly. He only clued in when Naruto's hands wrapped around Takujin's arm, sparked slightly. Naruto didn't give him time to react, and both shinobi became covered in lightning. Only one screamed, however, and Naruto took to the chance to free himself by planting both his feet on Takujin's chest and wrenching himself free in a backflip, being sure to throw him handfuls of shuriken to cover his retreat as he shunshined to a safe distance. He reappeared and crouched and hissed in pain as his hand fully registered the cut across his lower half. How bad is it, Kurama? Not crippling, but it's bleeding a lot, combined with your other injuries. If you don't finish soon, I'm not sure how long I can keep you conscious, Kurama replied. Naruto grimaced internally. Focus on keeping my blood pumping. I can fight through some pain and not unconscious, he instructed. Now focused on the recovering Takejin before him. There was no focused on the recovering Takejin before him. There was no verbal reply, but he immediately felt his injuries began aching more. A pulse seemed in time with his repaid beating heart. Takejin coughed hoarsely across from him. That was a cheap shot, boy, he growled as he stood. He span his spear and pointed the blade sternly at him. Consider this a professional courtesy. No more messing around. Go all out or these kids will pay for your demise. Naruto stood as well, being sure to make it appear that his wound was nothing more than an annoyance. Professional courtesy? For shinobi, he snorted and adjusted himself accordingly. Then consider it a gift for amusing me thus far. Naruto grit his teeth, ignoring Kujin's way for indicating it he was right. If he lost here, then the others were in danger. The teachers, Ainwood, and the Shnee might beat him in the end, but the students might be caught in the crossfire. Takujin had no qualms with including innocents after all. The trouble was his only offense at the moment was taijutsu, by far his weakest discipline, not counting genjutsu. His kenjutsu was now null since his only blade was now in pieces across the floor. He had no backup, and engaging in close range with only kunai had exactly worked out well the last time. Naruto frowned That was a lie. He actually did have a backup sword, but he only kept in a seal on his forearm for sentimental purposes. He never used it before, and it was a different sword from what he was used to. But despite time called for this desperate measures, Naruto reached for his blackened sleeve and pulled it up to his elbow, revealing a trail of seals that blended together to look like tattoos. He touched the specific point, and in a puff of smoke, the large sheath fell into his hand. The sheath was black, and the thin red rope wrapped around it to create the crisscross pattern. The guard was a red swirl, the symbol of his clan, and the hilt was wrapped in blood-red leather, and 9 red tassels hung from the end. It was longer and heavier than his ninjato and katana, his mother's blade. Now he almost reverently unsheathed it, allowing the ashy gray blade to gleam slightly in the dim light. Ospin, he muttered once and delicately through the sheath, the man who caught it without hesitation. Naruto readied himself and bared his blade towards his enemy. Takojin did the same, and for a small moment it was quiet. Both took a step forwards, and in the same moment appeared in the middle of the small blades locked. By the time the bystanders had processed this, several more strikes had been exchanged, both shinobi moving so fast that the students and teachers had a hard time witnessing even the blurs of their movement. They reappeared in the center with their blades locked and sparking from the friction as neither gave any ground to the other. "You're stronger than I thought, brat," Takojin gritted out, pushing heavier against the boy. "And you're faster than I predicted, old man," Naruto spat back, channeling the chakra to match his opponent. Eager to end the stalemate, twisted the blade, and Takojin slid right off into his path, and Naruto wasted no time in slicing him with his katana, and rather than glancing off his skin, like before, this time it left a neat red line across his torso. Takujin yelled in anger and pain, and Naruto scarcely had the chance to blink before he was launched across the room from Takujin's free hand, smashing him across the jaw. He flew for a moment before smashing back through the same tables and then hitting the wall behind. He wasted no time in getting back up, and he instinctively swung his sword and parried Takujin's follow-up attack and struck out with his own, which was dodged. They both backed up slightly and circled each other slowly, being sure to keep each other in sight. Then once again they attacked. Furious blurs and sparks moved around the hall as the two clashed. Unlike before, however, the two didn't halt in any fashion. Back and forth they went, neither willing to give ground to the other, simply absorbing hits and dishing it back in return. It was a dance of death that the two were masters of. While Tekujin sunk deeper and deeper into bloodlust, Naruto sunk deeper into tranquility, his mind and body working in sync to become the perfect masters of death. His new sword worked with him as if he'd wielded his whole life rather than only a few minutes. He was always made from combat. During the war, the Toads had taught him Zen mode, meditating to blend a nature chakra with his own to become stronger. The trade was that meditation in the middle of combat for 5 minutes was a bad idea, given for a power-up as strong as Zen mode, so he trained to make it shorter, working tirelessly to reduce the time to even a second. And he did. However, in combat with another shinobi, that second could mean his death, and he trained harder. The toads told him it was impossible to gather nature chakra while you moved, so he trained to prove them wrong. The process went lengthily and more time-consuming than even when he was training the first time. As he fought, he gathered nature chakra in small increments, even as he moved and battled slowly, increasing his strength and durability. The longer he fought, the stronger he got, and the stronger he got, the easier it became to beat his opponent. It was the ultimate form of battle meditation, and it clearly showed. Ever so slightly, Naruto began getting the upper hand. A cut there, a slice there, a bruise there. Naruto steadily got more and more hits in, but either not getting hit in turn or simply shrugging them off without a second thought. It seemed that Takojin began to notice as well as his opponent got stronger themselves and more unpredictable, as he relied on his innate instinct to fight rather than his mind, a sort of like how he used to expect. This was born of anger rather than a simple inability to fight properly. As the battle heated up further, it wasn't long before both sides started use the elements to their advantages. Takujin began incorporating spears and spikes of stone into his attacks, always trying to catch Naruto off guard. Naruto, on the other hand, used lightning to add extreme punches to his attacks, even adding little slices of wind to add more cutting power. Lightning cracked wide, wiping the rocks and rock shattered. The fighting was now done and was done at range. Elemental attacks had taken the highlight of the fighting, as the two engaged with jutsu rather than with swords. Naruto noticeably scaled back at the barrier, working to keep anything from reaching the students above. In another moment, they were back at each other's throats, clashing blades once more, trying to outfight the other in match of strength and speed. Takujin's strength and experience versus Naruto's skill and speed. Without warning or reason, Naruto backed off, hurriedly catching Takojin momentarily off guard, but not for long. The older man rushed forward, hoping to catch Naruto on his retreat. Seemingly out of desperation, Naruto formed a thick wall of water between them, which easily bypassed by a thrust from Takojin, oblivious to the smirk that now stretched the boy's mask. With a wave of his arm, he used his control over wind to change the temperature around the wall to below zero within a moment, freezing the water in a blink of an eye, trapping Takojin's arm and Nagatana within the wall. Naruto backed off further as the seal drew itself on the wall before their very eyes. Apparently, it was familiar to Takojin because his eyes widened and his tugging became frantic. The seals exploded, showing the room. A barrier with shards of ice, and tossing Takujin across the room like a fireball. Naruto watched the smoke again, waiting to see the state that Takujin was in, grimming, hoping that this was the end of it. It wasn't. Faster than Naruto could react at the time, a lance of stone flew out the smoke, and while he managed to block it in time, the sheer strength threw him onto the ground painfully as he was pelted with broken bits of rock. There were many shots of concern from the second level as Naruto panted on the ground, ripping bits of stone from his body without remorse. He cursed violently under his breath and retrieved his sword from the ground. The instant he finished, Takujin flew out the smoke, his skin charred and blackened from his encounter with an explosion. Two mean-looking daggers now replaced his nagatana, and fury raged his eyes. Naruto swiftly found himself on the back foot from Takujin's furious offensive. Now possessing the largest weapon meant he was practically useless in close combat. This doesn't mean he was defeated. His sword arm worked overtime, blocking and parrying Takujin's attacks, letting nothing through. His blade provided what seemed like a silver bubble of protection to the outside world as its wielders twirled around, almost trying to stay moving. Naruto ducked under a swing, spinning and deflecting the second on the way back up, only to come face to face with a backhand that sent him careening across the hall and into the opening wall uh, above the stairs. He recovered quickly enough to raise his katana with two hands to block a heavy knife aimed at his throat. Takujin pinned him to the wall now. Then his mind cleared further that he realized Takujin had two of the knives, and he kicked up his leg into the crook of Takujin's elbow as he stepped forward, halting it in its tracks before it could pierce any further than his black jacket. They were partly motionless for half a minute, both stubbornly trying to outdo the other. Naruto's eyes flicked down, and he kicked out a piece of stone with his free leg that had become dislodged in their engagement. Switching with it, he swung at Takujin's head once he was oriented, but only scored a long gash across his face as he moved out of the way. Before he could pounce further, a pillar burst from the wall and impacted his already worn ribs and sent him back rolling down the stairs. He flipped to his feet and saw Takojin jumping for him, and he rolled out of the way, the ground crackling when Takojin landed. Naruto raised his blade and blocked 6 consecutive strikes before retaliating with his own stab, which was parried in return. Takojin kicked out, forcing the blonde to back off slightly, and then stabbed down from high with one of his knives, sensing an opportunity to end the fight. Naruto twisted to the side and allowed Teikojin's strike to harmlessly pass by and bury into the ground. With a switch, his katana followed it and stabbed the knife to the ground. Using it as a step, Naruto flipped over Teikojin's tall stature and lashed onto his shoulders, drawing a kunai as he did to plunge into Teikojin's neck in one swift move, until a hand roughly grabbed him by the jacket and slammed him heavily into the ground at his feet. Dropping the kunai, he grabbed his katana and switched with a wooden chair that was simply obliterated by Tekujin's heavy strike. An instant later, Naruto considered his options as he hid away in the shadows. There weren't many. He wiped blood out of his eye and silently ripped a sleeve off to wrap around his heavily bleeding midsection. His body was in bad shape, and his battle meditation wasn't leveling the field as he'd hoped. The durability, it seemed actively more of a number numbing agent than actually durability, judging by the increased number of cuts and bruises. A straight up fight was out of the question from here on out. The issue was what to do in the place of it. Was it worth revealing some of his abilities to succeed in the battle and potentially put everything at risk to save a few people he'd only known for nearly a year, compared to the village he'd served for most of his life, the village he sacrificed so much for? Kitsune! A voice whimpered from the hall. Oh, he'd left Takujin alone with the students, so while he tended to himself, the difficulty just ramped up. Naruto strode from his hiding spot behind the stairs and bore witness to a small girl in a white dress being held by Takojin with a knife to her throat. Whis! He stopped in front of the stairs, and a thunder of footsteps heralded the arrival of the others. Naruto's arm snapped out to catch Ruby as she tried to barrel past. Don't be stupid, he chastised quietly, keeping his eyes on Whis. He missed the betrayed look as she sent him. He pushed his partner in the weighted arms of his sister. Keep hold of her, he instructed without looking away. Shinobi, do something! Winter hissed from behind him. At least she had the sense to not be direct. Kitsune, do you have a plan? Aspen asked quietly, stepping next to him, a serious look on his eyes. Naruto remained silent, and the two teams shared a worried glance. Ruby struggled harder and began pleading with her sister to let her go. All right, Brett, this has gone long enough. It was fun while it lasted, but I've got a job to do and you're in the way. Takujin finally spoke up. Drop it, he gestured to his katana with his head, and when he didn't instantly do so, he pressed the knife harder to Whis' throat, causing a small drip of blood to trickle down her neck. Now, he commanded. Naruto did, ignoring the further looks of horror sent his way. Tekojin grinned. Good, now kick it away. Naruto did. Your pouches too, and your harness. Won't want you getting any ideas with those seals of yours. Naruto unhooked his harness and it dropped down. Next came the leg pouch and then the hip one. What are you doing? Winter yelled, this time panic and fear flittered in her voice. All right, I've done what you said. Now let her go. Naruto insisted, secretly applying a small genjutsu so small he hoped that Takujin wouldn't notice. Takujin chuckled darkly. And why would I do that? This here is a shnin. I know people who would pay handsomely for this little one. Naruto's hand went to the small of his back, where a gray holster sat permanently camouflaged. And if you do that, you'll always have people after you. Naruto stalled as his hand surrounded the grip. I'm a missing nin. I already do, Takojin countered easily. Naruto's eyes flicked to a kunai in the middle between the two of them. Whis, look at me. She did, and Naruto couldn't stop at the twitch his heart made at the sheer fear in her eyes. Do you trust me? There was utter silence at his words before the girl in question nodded as best she could.
Aspen, he stared, gaining his attention. Catch! Naruto's arm wiped up in a flash as he cut the illusion, revealing the barrel of Naruto's Ambu service pistol aimed squarely at Takujin's forehead, while to the others, the events that followed were too quick for regular eyes to follow. To Naruto's, it was slow motion. He pulled the trigger to his pistol, the slide shooting back as a lightning-infused bullet was ejected from the barrel. Before the slide had even rested, Naruto had chucked the sidearm to the side and darted forward towards the kunai he had seen earlier. By now Takujin was reacting rather slowly, considered Naruto caught him off guard with the pistol and leaned back to avoid the bullet that grazed his cheek. The other's eyes that had just widened. Naruto swooped down and scooped up the discarded kunai and locked eyes with Whis for less than a second. In a cloud of smoke, their places were switched and the blonde had his back to Takujin with a knife warningly close to his face. His right elbow lashed backwards into the man's stomach, and then his left followed up with a hit to the temple immediately after, throwing back at Takujin. He transitioned the kunai into a reverse grip and span cut in Takujin's unprotected stomach and then disarmed him with his left. He staggered slightly as Takujin recovered to plant a foot in his heavily battered chest, briefly seeing stars as he scored a direct hit on his wound, but he shook it off and pressed forward again. This time Takujin was ready and he caught the arm, but a simple flick and the kunai switched hands and the attack continued unhindered. Lightning arched as he fed chakra through the steel, and he plunged forward. Spin a breath caught in his throat as he watched Naruto's rescue attempt to unfold and succeed. Whis now successfully held within her sister's arms rather than the shinobi's. The room remained still. The only sound filling the silence was the gradual buzzing of the blue lightning protruding from the brute's back. But that too soon fled. The kunai held by the teenager slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. The hand formerly holding it flexed before disappearing as Kitsune ripped his arm back through the brute's arm, allowing it to hit the floor with a quiet splat, a fist-sized hole clearly showing through his back. All eyes focused on the victor as he stood still, looking at his former opponent before he swayed and collapsed to his knees, clutching at something at his chest. Kitsune? Although the question was quiet, Pyra may as well have shouted it with how silent the room was. The answer to her clutching the answer to her query was an almost silent sigh of his own. He appeared to struggle with something before a squelching followed with his movement, and a stone rod about the length of his forearm was deposited to his side. Three quarters covered in red. There were more than a few horrified looks in the room now. He pawed around his flak jacket and withdrew his packet of cigarettes, placing one in his mouth and lighting after a few tries. He took a few drags and the tension clearly left his body before he gathered his own courage and marched up the boy who had likely saved all their lives. Kitsune looked up as Aspen approached with an obviously questioning look. Until the headmaster offered the shinobi his hand, Kitsune chuckled, although the movement appeared to hurt, and grabbed the offered appendage and got to his feet. Aspen felt the grip on his hand increase margin as Kitsune closed his eyes momentarily. However, that was the only indication that the boy was in any sort of pain. No doubt an achievement. He opened his eyes and focused on Aspen, giving the man a nod as the headmaster handed the man his sheath. Kitsune took the sheath and limped slightly over to Pyra, gently taking his katana from her after she recovered it. "Thank you," he said simply. Pyra smiled slightly in return, but couldn't keep the worry out of her eyes as she traced along the various bloodstains coating his outfit. "Interesting model," a voice commented. "Agent K USP semi-automatic with a silencer inbuilt into the frame. Forgive my forwardness, but I could have sworn this was only given to members of the Black Ops Ambu." All eyes turned back to Naruto. Naruto inadvertently twitched in annoyance. When he turned around, he saw Ironwood looking over his shoulder. "It usually is. However, I was a special case, as was equipped with upon my assignment here," Naruto seemingly lied. "Is that right?" Ironwood prodded, and a tense silence followed. Eventually, Ironwood flipped the gun so he was holding the barrel and offered it to the boy, who took it slowly and stuffed it back behind him. Naruto took another drag from his cigarette and began limping towards the door. Fiddling with his harness, he pulled the scroll from it and dropped it on the floor, where it rolled out, showing a storage seal. A second after it was completely rolled out, 15 clones of Naruto appeared, mask and all. "Clean this place up and take the bodies outside," he instructed, and left through the doors. Outside, he momentarily surveyed the damage as he gathered the scroll that released the small lake of water now present in the courtyard. With a few adjustments, the scroll was reversed and the water was gradually sucked back into the scroll. Next, with more focus than he'd cared to admit, more clones appeared around him and set about gathering the bodies and equipment strewn about and using weak blasts of water to clear away the numerous blood splatters. Naruto, meanwhile, began a slow walk back to his dorm, knowing his clones would get rid of the bodies properly. They were him after all. He grimaced as the adrenaline continued to wear off, his limp unconsciously getting heavier. "Kitsune!" a voice behind him shouted. He ignored it. "Kitsune, answer me!" The voice shouted again. "Uzumaki, you will answer me or help me!" Only 3 people in Remnant knew that name. One was Kami Knows-Where, the other was still tending to the students, and the last shouldn't know who he was because of a genjutsu he was wearing, or was. This time he stopped and waited for her to catch up. When she was behind him, ignorant of his injuries, he span and grabbed her. After shunching away to a nearby alley, he immediately threw her against the wall and held the kunai to her throat. "I don't care for the past we've held. You call me that again in public, and you'll mysteriously go missing." He snarled, and for a brief moment fear bled in Winter's eyes before fear replaced it. "What past we've had? We were in love for 6 months. I deserve to know why you're here." Winter snapped angrily and snapped the kunai aside. "In love? You were sick with hero worship after I saved you from being raped. We were on 2 different sides of a war. Even if we were in love, it could have never happened. There was too much damage for either side to accept it." Naruto replied. "We would have run away together, kept it a secret. It could have worked." Naruto shook his head. "We were too well known to keep anything a secret. You are the daughter of the man who caused the war, and I have killed more people from Remnant than anyone on both our histories. It would have never worked," he argued. Winter shook her head. "You don't know that. You're here now. We can go somewhere."
No, we can't. Whatever you think we had only existed in your mind, Naruto retorted, and Winter's face immediately fell before contorting in anger instead. "Maybe you weren't so different after all. I really thought you were," she snarled. "Perhaps I'm not," Naruto said simply and backed off. "I don't care for any past you think we've had. You mentioned my name again in public." He left the thread hanging before disappearing in a cloud of smoke. When he appeared in his room, he collapsed as a wave of agony tore through his body, barely stifling the yell of pain that escaped his lips. He panted for a minute before shakingly standing and locking the door and putting a chair underneath the handle to disallow anyone from disturbing him tonight. He had earned it after all. Cinderfall was a woman who liked to be in control of things and got rather miffed when things didn't go her way. This was one of those times. "You said that your man would do their job, so why is that damn shinobi still alive?" she raged as she paced between the beds of her dorm room. "Because the job wasn't to kill him," a dark corner answered. A single glowing red eye beckoned. "Why?" she demanded and glared at the corner. There was a shift in the air and she was suddenly whisked off her feet as a hand clamped down on her throat. The orange swirl mask startled disappointingly at her. "Be careful of your tongue, girl. You demand nothing of me. The leader of your little merry band and I have an accord, which means that if I want to do something, you will do it, not the other way around." He dropped her and she collapsed on her knees. "Their job was to test Uzumaki for future operations, and in doing so, they provided a distraction for you to slip in and complete your objective with no one cluing in. There was more at stake here than your petty grievances, understand?" The man growled, his body gradually swirling like his mask around a center point in his chest. Cinder coughed a few times and rubbed her throat. "Yes, Madara," she whispered, just as the man disappeared. End of chapter 14.